Hello and thank you so much for joining us. Whether you're watching on TV or online, I'm Anthony Robart. We are waiting for the latest update from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. In about 15 minutes or so, he will give his national address from his home at Rideau Cottage in Ottawa. He will then take questions from reporters. We'll bring that to you live the moment it begins. We also continue, of course, to monitor the latest numbers of COVID-19 infections in Canada and around the world. Let's begin with the big picture. And globally, there are now almost 2.1 million confirmed cases of coronavirus, with almost 650,000 of those in the United States, a significant number, where there have been more than 28,500 deaths linked to COVID-19 already. In Canada, nearly 29,000 people have tested positive for the virus. And taking a closer look at the number of cases across our country, Quebec still has the most infections, with close to 15,000 cases. Ontario nearing the 9,000 mark with 514 new cases today. And it seems we've passed a grim milestone. COVID-19 has now claimed more than 1,000 lives in Canada. But despite all this, there are some signs of hope. No new cases have been reported in Manitoba since Monday. So a lot to get to, of course. Let's bring in our Ottawa Bureau Chief, Mercedes Stevenson, who, I guess, somewhere different today. You're actually in the Bureau. Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm in studio, yeah.
Must be nice to get out of the house, I imagine. So let's talk about, first of all, what we can expect from the Prime Minister today.
So today we're expecting the Prime Minister to talk about expanding the program for small loans to get small businesses to get loans. And this has been something that is to help augment the other programs that are out there. So yesterday we heard about the CERB. That, of course, is the emergency benefit to help people who have lost work because of COVID-19. Then there is the wage supplement program. That's to help companies pay their employees. And now there's this particular program which helps businesses to pay other costs, because it's great that there is the wage subsidy program, but at the end of the day, businesses have additional costs. Many have to pay commercial rent, which can be extremely expensive. Even simple things like hydro, electricity, heat, all of those things, internet that they have to keep running, those have costs. A lot of businesses have to pay for things up front in terms of equipment or maintenance on that equipment, capital costs. They may owe money to people from when they were operating for supplies that were bought during that time. So the government does have a program that businesses can apply for loans through. But we're going to hear about an expansion or an easing of that program going forward. One of the critiques had been that businesses who have less than $50,000 a year in payroll did not qualify. And some small or new businesses were saying that they didn't meet that. There's also a lot of different kinds of businesses in Canada, as we're finding out with the viewer email that we get, and some of them were not included. So we'll find out exactly what the government is doing today to expand this program. It's been their pattern throughout that they basically announce a program to get it out there, and then they sort of steadily expand it as time goes on to increase groups that haven't been left out or adjust it. So this fits sort of with their overall pattern of how they have approached this crisis.
Yeah, it was a glaring gap, as you highlight, because so many businesses, right, as we've heard already, are closing their doors, and more expected to do so, which is an incredibly sad story. And a lot of, they were offered loans, but a lot of them just don't want to take and cannot take on more debt. Real quick, I want to ask you about the call that he had with the G7 leaders this morning. Do we know, I imagine he's going to take questions on that. Do we know what came out of that?
We don't know what came out of it yet, but we do know what the intentions were going in. And that was for the leaders to talk about a coordinated approach to COVID-19. We've heard a lot about sort of the chaos on the international scene of trying to deal with this, including what Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland described as the Wild West when it came to procuring personal protective equipment. So this is a call between the leaders of the 7 biggest economies to say, okay, what are we going to do to fight this pandemic going forward? You don't want to have one country doing something that undermines what another country is doing. At the end of the day, as you know, the G7 is a group of countries. They don't have any ability to enforce will on members. But the idea is to try to coordinate as much as possible, to share concerns. And of course, there is that one wild card in there, and that's the United States and Donald Trump, who's talking about easing social restrictions, about potentially reopening the border with Canada. So I imagine those kinds of discussions about borders and international flights, as well as how to relaunch the economy, Anthony, after all of this ends, which is something governments are starting to have to think about. Even though they're telling us prepare to hunker down for weeks, and that is still true, the economy won't launch on a dime.
And I imagine a lot more will come out of the call tonight that he will have with the premiers. We'll get to that in a little bit, and he will expect to give a little more information on that in his address. Mercedes, we'll leave it there for now. Thank you so much. And as we mentioned, no new cases in Manitoba, but that province, the government adopting new powers and stiffer penalties in its fight against COVID-19. Several bills, in fact, were passed in a one-day emergency sitting of the legislature. Among them, a bill that gives the PC cabinet broad powers to make emergency orders. New laws were also passed addressing job protection, eviction freezes, and price gouging. And further west in British Columbia, where the state of emergency has been extended until April 28th. However, Premier John Horgan's announcement came with some good news. He says the province has seen some success in bending the trajectory of COVID-19. Health officials are planning to release updated projections tomorrow. Horgan says those projections will help the province as it considers really when to ease the lockdown measures. So let's stay west, and Heather Yerkes-West joins us from Calgary. Heather, you look at the numbers. We talked about the numbers between Ontario, Quebec in the east, and further west, Alberta, British Columbia, for example. A stark difference. And we're already hearing, some of the provinces, Saskatchewan and British Columbia, at least talking about easing restrictions. Not there yet, but set us up and catch everyone us up on what the situation is there.
Yeah, this is something that obviously people are very anxious to look towards. When can we start reopening things, getting back to normal? We are having some positive news out of these Western provinces, as you mentioned. Numbers are lower. The curve seems to be flattening out. We seem to be having a little bit more success. But when it comes to firm dates, we're really in a position now that it is too soon to say. For example, yesterday, the Premier of Alberta was asked about the Calgary Stampede, which is, of course, a world-class event. It attracts people from all over the world, and it is scheduled to begin on July 3rd. Well, at this point, we still don't know whether that event will be going forward. It hasn't been canceled officially. It does begin on July 3rd, but right now the Stampede officials are saying that they are on pause right now, and the Premier of Alberta is saying that we're just not in a position to make a decision one way or the other. We are seeing sort of a steady amount of cases in Alberta, but we are seeing some concerning things happening elsewhere up in the oil sands. We had a report yesterday of an outbreak there, 3 cases connected to an oil sands camp north of Fort McMurray, and this is of course very concerning because this is a fly-in, fly-out camp. A lot of workers come in from other parts of the province, but also other parts of the country, and these are camps that the Premier says we're just not able to close them down because they are essential services, and even though we've seen oil prices dip significantly and production sort of ramp down. Ramping down is very different than shutting these projects down completely. Premier Kenney said yesterday that if we were to shut these down, this would jeopardize billions of dollars worth of infrastructure well beyond this particular crisis. So that's something that he is at least saying is not possible right now. Health officials instead are saying that they're trying to mitigate these risks as best as possible, and things like enhanced cleaning protocol and screening for travelers as they're coming in and out of these sites. But again, as we're seeing that this isn't foolproof. We are seeing, 3 cases. One, Imperial Oil, who owns this Curl Lake camp, is saying that at least one of the 3 cases is still at the camp. The other 2 became ill after they returned home. And there are 6 others who are suspected cases. They are in isolation and they are awaiting test results. So this is another very concerning situation that we're watching here out west.
And I want to get to the other news of another hit to the economy, specifically for one company, WestJet. They announced more layoffs as well. What more do we know on that? We also heard, recently they're going to take advantage of the wage subsidy program. How does that play out?
Yeah, this is disappointing news. We heard, as you mentioned a few days ago, that they would be, taking advantage of the wage subsidy so that a number of people were getting back to work. But then again, yesterday there was news that a number of the pilots are being laid off as well. The airline industry certainly taking a hit. We just don't know when air travel will be able to resume again. There's just so many industries that have been hit so hard across this pandemic, and as the federal government rolls out help sort of as quickly as it can, we're seeing that these industries are still having to scale back, and as a result, jobs are really being impacted.
A significant number, 1,700 pilots. All right, Heather, thank you so much. Heather Yerkes-West joining us from Calgary. And, as we look south of the border, U.S. intelligence and national security right now investigating new theories about COVID-19. U.S. President Donald Trump says his government is trying to determine if the coronavirus originated in a Wuhan laboratory where contagious samples were being stored. This theory being pushed by supporters of the president who, as you can imagine, are eager to deflect criticisms of his handling of the pandemic. China has denied Trump's allegations, as well as claims that it delayed reporting on the virus outbreak late last year. Meanwhile, President Trump is suggesting that he is prepared to at least support easing travel restrictions between Canada and the United States.
Our relationship with Canada is very good. We'll talk about that. It will be one of the early borders to be released. Canada's doing well. We're doing well. We'll see. But at some point, we'll be doing that.
Now, these comments come less than 24 hours after Ottawa tightened self-isolation rules for anyone entering Canada. A non-essential travel ban between our two countries came into effect mid-March. Incidentally, it is set to expire next week. All right, here's a live shot of the doors at Rideau Cottage. We will bring you the Prime Minister's address the moment it begins. That is expected roughly in about 4 minutes, give or take. We'll bring that to you live the moment it happens. Let's stay in Ottawa and bring in our chief political correspondent, David Akin. So, David, let's start there with the possible easing of restrictions, at least if the President of the United States has his way. A major contrast, of course, to where we are in this country, because we heard yesterday it's not happening yet. Set us up.
Yeah, no, it isn't happening yet. And you're right to reference the fact that right now, let's say Trump relaxed the border restrictions and you could go in for reasons of tourism or shopping. Great. You go to the United States. When you come back, you're going right into a 14-day quarantine. That's the rule right now for anybody coming in from any border crossing, United States or anywhere. You're going to a 14-day quarantine. Number two, right now, we have a ban on foreign nationals. That includes American citizens, except those that are doing essential work, truck drivers essentially. So we'd have to be looking at lifting that. And it certainly doesn't sound like Prime Minister Trudeau and public health authorities in Canada, anyhow, right now, are ready to lift those border restrictions. In fact, we've seen premiers in British Columbia and Alberta within the last week both talk about more controls at the border, more tests on people coming across the border, more public health officials at our land crossings. Right now, that's a bit of an issue. So we definitely want to keep this border with the United States open for all the essential traffic. And, as far as I know, we haven't heard from business groups or organizations that are doing some of this essential travel that there's been a sticky border involved, that we're still getting groceries, for example, are coming up from Mexico by truck to Canadian grocery stores. That's still happening. But this will be something we want to extend, certainly making sure essential travel continues back and forth. But I think also Canada has got to acknowledge the fact, and I think Canada does acknowledge the fact, that right now the United States is a hot spot. And one of our neighbor states, New York State, obviously, is one of the hottest of hot spots in the United States. Governor Cuomo there just yesterday saying that everyone in New York State required to wear a mask when they go outside. That doesn't sound like the kind of population that I think Canadian authorities are ready to have travel into Canada for tourism or shopping, those sorts of things.
Yeah, and Michigan also another hot spot, another border state. So I want to as well get to the at least concern, the fear of a food shortage in this country. How serious is that?
Yeah, so I think it's important to talk about let me just back up here a little bit. No experts, no government official, the ag minister believes that we're going to have a food shortage or there's going to be a food security crisis, at least for those who can afford to buy groceries. What there will be, though, is some problems in the supply chain with pork and beef. And here's the problem. A major pork packing plant in the United States, the Smithfield plant in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, it shut down indefinitely this week because its workers were sick. That plant alone accounts for 5% of the pork processing capacity in the United States. So back on the farm, you've got all these farmers with hogs ready to go to market. They're now frantically looking for new places, new pork processing plants. Could they ship them up to Canada? Well, possibly, but here in Canada, there's been a processing capacity issue. The big processor in Canada is a company called Olimel, based out of Montreal, but also with factories and plants in Western Canada. They had one of their major pork processing plants shut down for 2 weeks up near Trois-Rivières, Quebec. That plant just opened this week. This plant does something around 27,000 hogs a week, and that's major capacity. And that plant just came back online, but they're only operating really at half levels right now. So there's a capacity right now in terms of pork processing. What about beef? Well, 40%, believe it or not, 40% of the beef in Canadian grocery stores is processed through a single plant in Calgary. It's the Cargill plant in Calgary, and that plant too has had workers who've been ill with COVID-19. The plant's still operating, but it's barely half a shift. I'm not sure if it's half a shift. So that plant, again, responsible for 40% of Canada's beef, right now is just not operating at capacity. So the end result,
David, I'm going to jump in there. The Prime Minister is about to start speaking.
Cuts of beef and
let's listen in there.
I had a call with the other G7 leaders to discuss the pandemic. We all remain committed to doing whatever it takes to help people and our economies rebound after this crisis. We're working together to support international efforts to develop a vaccine, expand treatment, expand testing, and ensure that critical medical supplies get to the front lines. As I've said before, this is a global crisis, and it demands a global response. While we're doing everything to keep people safe in our respective countries, we also have to help more vulnerable nations fight this virus by providing more support for their healthcare systems, debt relief, and other forms of assistance. We will keep working together as partners to ensure the safety and health of people around the world.
Over the last few weeks, our government presented a series of measures to help people go through these difficult times due to this pandemic. With the emergency wage subsidy, we allow more people to continue receiving wages, although the company for which they work had to slow down or stop its activities. With the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, we give $2,000 a month to people who can't earn a living due to the COVID virus. And yesterday, we announced that we would loosen the eligibility criteria to allow more people to get the assistance they need. If you are a seasonal worker, if you earn less than $1,000 a month, or if you recently run out of employment insurance benefits, this emergency benefit will be there for you. At the same time, we work with the provinces and territories to increase wages for essential workers who earn less than $2,500 a month. Auxiliary nurses, elderly care workers, all those who work hard to keep things normal are making extraordinary efforts, even if the conditions are more and more difficult. They deserve not only our gratitude, but our support. And tonight, I will be speaking about this with my colleagues from provinces and territories during our weekly meeting. We will also discuss how we can better protect our elders who are in these homes or long-term care facilities. Last night, the Bill Blair, Public Safety Minister, received an official request for assistance from the Quebec government to give help to the healthcare workers. We are working closely with Quebec to finalize this assistance program, and we will have more news to give you very soon. But I can tell you that we will give them all possible assistance, looking through the Canadian Red Cross, the Canadian Armed Forces, and specialized volunteers who registered with Health Canada. We will always be there for Canadians facing difficulties. Another challenge that often comes up during this meeting with premiers is the supply for medical equipment. I can confirm this morning that the government finalized contracts with several Canadian companies, such as Geometric Energy Corporation from Calgary, which will give thousands of gloves to our healthcare workers. Later today, Minister Anand will give an update about the latest developments on these supplies.
Over the past few weeks, we've rolled out a series of measures to get people the help they need as quickly as possible. As things evolve, we're hearing from Canadians who need more help, from businesses who need more support. No one should feel as if they're alone in this fight. Our government is here to help you through these challenging times. So when we hear the program is not reaching as many people as it should, we make changes. A few weeks ago, we launched the Canada Emergency Business Account to help small businesses struggling with cash flow. Under this program, banks are offering $40,000 loans, which are guaranteed by the government. To date, more than 195,000 loans have been approved. We're talking about more than $7.5 billion in credit to small and medium-sized businesses. It's a start, but Minister Ng and others have heard from business owners who could really use this help, but who do not fit the current admissibility criteria. So we're going to make some adjustments because we want to be there to support you. Today, we are expanding the Canada Emergency Business Account by both increasing and decreasing the eligibility threshold. Now, businesses who spend between $20,000 and $1.5 million in total payroll in 2019 will be eligible to receive a loan through the CEBA. That's businesses who spent between $20,000 and $1.5 million in total payroll in 2019 who will now be eligible. This is money entrepreneurs and employers can use to cover operational costs and help with other immediate needs. Businesses and commercial property owners are also facing specific challenges because of COVID-19, so we plan on introducing the Canada Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance. This program will provide support to help small businesses with their rent for the months of April, May, and June. To implement this program, we have to work with the provinces and territories as they govern rental relationships, and we hope to have more details to share very soon.
Several weeks ago, we started the Canada Emergency Business Loan, and this program allows banks to give up to $40,000 to eligible businesses to help them with liquidities. Up until now, more than 195,000 loans have been approved. This is $7.5 billion in credit for small and medium-sized businesses. It is a beginning. Minister Ng and others have spoken to several employers who need this help, but who are presently not admissible under the program right now. So today, we are enlarging the range by increasing the thresholds for admissibility. Now, businesses that have spent anywhere between $20,000 and $1.5 million in payroll costs will be able to make a request for a guaranteed loan. This is the kind of financings that entrepreneurs and employers will be able to use to fix their liquidity problems as well as other expenses. Moreover, business owners of commercial business lenders will be able to be helped with the commercial program in order to help small and medium-sized businesses with their rents for May and June. And in order to set up this program, we have to collaborate with territories and provinces because they deal with everything that has to do with rents. And we'll have more details about that soon.
Used to this new normal. It's been snowing in some places this week, including here in Ottawa, because that's just what 2020 brings. But we hope that the weather will get nicer As time goes on, staying home and not seeing friends is going to be even more difficult. We're going to miss our colleagues, our friends, our neighbours, and our parents even more than we do now. But we have to be disciplined. We must stay the course. We cannot let the progress we've made go to waste. And above all, we cannot put lives at risk. So let's keep following public health recommendations. Wash your hands. Stay home as much as possible. And if you do go out, be sure to stay at least 2 meters away from others. If we persist and persevere, I know that we will prevail. Once again, thank you all for joining us. I'm now happy to take questions.
Thank you, Prime Minister. We'll now go to the phone lines for some questions. Just one question, one follow-up. Operator.
Thank you. Merci. The first question, la première question, l'inaudible, la presse canadienne. À vous.
Oui, bonjour, Monsieur Trudeau.
Hello, Mr. Trudeau. About this help that Quebec has asked you for, and you said there'll be details later, but you said that you were going to examine the question of the Red Cross, the Army, and volunteers. Has it already been decided that they will be helping? Quebec has already asked for twice for help, and we have been able to fulfill that need very quickly, like the Canadian Rangers that went to the Lower North Shore and Nunavik. Yesterday, we received a third request that we are examining because it's a little bit different than what has been asked the Army to do in the past. So we are now examining with them the best way to help Quebec in these difficult times. I acknowledge to what extent people are worried for their parents and for the seniors who are in nursing homes or in long-term care facilities. We understand that we must find ways to help even more, and we will be there to help, but we will need to undertake more conversations with Quebec to figure out exactly how we can help and respond to this unusual request, because this is a very unusual situation. Question. So what is unusual about this request? Is it because it's for long-term care facilities specifically? What's strange about it? Answer. Well, it is because it is requesting medical help, trained personnel, and our forces certainly have doctors, but not that many, and we're trying to figure out exactly how we can help out, and these are the discussions that we are having with them. As armed forces are used to helping with things like flooding, and they are trained to help in all kinds of situations of the kind. This is a new situation, so we are speaking with Quebec in order to figure out how best to help, but certainly we are there to help. We understand to what extent this is important. Thank you very much. Next question. Next question, Émilie Bergeron from the Échange Commis. Yes, hello, Mr. Trudeau. Could you give us some more specifications about the kind of help that is being requested for by Quebec? Are we talking about health that is specifically for long-term care facilities? Answer. This is a request that we have received yesterday. We acknowledge that we need to work with them, and we know that it is specifically, of course, for long-term care facilities and nursing homes. We are trying to figure out exactly how the federal government is best able to help, and we will be working closely with the province to help, and we know how important it is there, and we are definitely there to help. Question, follow-up. What will happen Monday? The House of Commons has been suspended until April 20th. That's next Monday. If there is no agreement with the Conservatives, what could then happen? What are you fearing could happen? Answer. There is nothing to fear. Our democracy is very healthy, and institutions must continue to operate, not in spite of the crisis, but because of the crisis. We are in talks with the opposition parties to make sure that we find the best way possible to continue the work that is done by our democratic institutions, whilst ensuring that we continue to follow the recommendations restrictions and the guidelines that are given by our healthcare professionals. We are, I think, about to conclude these discussions, and we'll have certainly more to announce in how the Parliament will be working out in the weeks to come.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Ryan Tumulty, National Post. Line open.
Yeah, good morning, Prime Minister. I'm wondering, when you're meeting with the premiers today, are you going to discuss how to phase and reopen the economy? I'm wondering if you're at all concerned that the possibility that some provinces that are doing better may reopen before other provinces, creating a strain there.
I think one of the things we've seen across the country from leaders and from citizens is a desire to know when this is going to be over, how soon we're going to be able to start getting back to normal life. But I think everyone understands that until we have a vaccine, until we are in a place where there is proper treatment, there is a massive amount of testing, we are not going to be able to talk about getting back to normal. We will, hopefully, in the coming time, be able to loosen certain restrictions. But our health professionals and experts and all leaders understand that that has to be done at the right moment and very, very carefully. It would be absolutely disastrous for us to open up too early or too quickly and have another wave hit us that could be just as bad as this one, and find ourselves in a situation of having to go back into quarantine the way we are right now, and have everything that we've done these past weeks be for nothing. We know that there are lots of conversations to be had about how we reopen our economy, what happens in the right order, what the sequencing is, how we keep people safe. But we're a long way from having the ability to start doing that. Of course, conversations are ongoing now, but we're still many weeks away from talking about actually doing anything to reopen our economy, even with the variations across the country of the local state of the pandemic.
Follow-up, Brian?
And then in terms of that discussion, do you envision that it will be based on metrics? Will it be based on the number of new cases, say, or some sort of metrics-based approach to making that decision, I guess?
I think looking at where we are on the curve, the number of new cases, the decline in cases will be an important piece of it. But I think what's even more important is the measures that we will have in place to be vigilant, to respond if and when there are resurgences of the virus in local pockets, in particular areas. We're going to need to be extremely vigilant, extremely prepared to respond quickly with massive testing, with contact tracing, with measures that people will be able to kick in very quickly if that comes. I don't think we can talk about reopening things until we are confident that we have exactly the plan on responding to future resurgences in place, and that's a lot of what the conversations are going on right now.
Thank you. Next question, operator.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, David Engren, Reuters. Line open.
Yeah, good morning, Prime Minister. On your G7 call, what, if anything, did other leaders say to President Trump about his decision to suspend funding for the World Health Organization?
I think we all recognize on the call how important it is to continue to coordinate and collaborate the science around the pandemic, to work on public health measures around the world, to share information around vaccine development, around treatments that can work. There is a need for international coordination, and the WHO is an important part of that collaboration and coordination. We recognize that there have been questions asked, but at the same time, it is really important that we stay coordinated as we move through this. That's certainly what Canada is going to do.
And secondly, President Trump yesterday suggested at the border with Canada the restrictions could be loosened. Are there any such plans from your point of view?
I think there was a recognition by the President, as I've highlighted many times, that the closeness, the collaboration, the friendship between Canada and the United States is quite unlike any other. And therefore, the work that we continue to do to keep our citizens safe while coordinating very carefully is unlike our approaches with other countries around the world. There's a recognition that as we move forward, there will be special thought given to this relationship. But at the same time, we know that there is a significant amount of time still before we can talk about loosening such restrictions. Okay. Nous reconnaissons que
we recognize that Canada and the United States have a very special friendship that is not like any other country in the world. We recognize that we can work together at more integrated levels than many other countries. And that is what the President underlined, and that's what I often underline as well. We will continue coordinating our efforts, collaborating, but the reality is that we are still many weeks away from being able to talk of softening these restrictions at the border or on social distancing.
Minister Molly Thomas, CTV National News. You said there would be a significant amount of time, I guess, to having this border discussion. What is the danger to Canada to opening that border?
We are having ongoing discussions on border issues, on supply chains with the United States all the time. We have a integrated economic relationship and a close people-to-people friendship within our countries that allowed us to move forward on closing the borders in a way that assured essential services and supplies continue to travel. We will continue to look at ways we can move forward to help each other deal with this pandemic. We recognize that it will be time still before we can loosen those border restrictions.
What is the danger, though, Prime Minister?
We recognize that there is a need to protect our citizens, as every country is doing. Most countries around the world move forward on restricting travel, and Canada and the United States are no exception.
Sorry, in French?
Okay.
There are many countries throughout the world which have limited travel and control their borders to anyone except essential workers and essential goods, and that's what we will continue to do.
About retaliation at all from the Americans if we don't open on the timeline that they might want?
The coordination and collaboration between Canada and the United States on this issue and on all issues has been entirely exemplary. The reflection that the President shared was one of how close we are and how the status of the Canada-U.S. relationship is different than the status of relationships that we have with other countries around the world. There was a recognition that we will do things perhaps differently than other countries, but there is still a recognition that we need to continue holding that the measures that we have in place for a good while to come still.
Prime Minister Janet Silver, Global News. With people dying at group homes for disabilities and Premier Ford saying that the situation in long-term care homes should be, quote, a wake-up call for the world, what is your government planning to do to support the country's most vulnerable citizens, not only now, but in the weeks to come?
Well, tonight, I will be speaking with the premiers, and we will be talking directly about how to ensure better protection for our elders in long-term care. It is impossible to imagine the anguish families and indeed our elders are going through in this situation. There is just so much fear, so much uncertainty. We need to do a better job of being there for them. The federal government is looking at ways to support the provinces as they deal with this issue. We're discussing pay top-ups for people who work in those situations because the conditions are getting more and more difficult. There are also more regulations we can talk about bringing in to do a better job of protecting our most vulnerable. I think that's what Canadians expect. Okay.
We will tonight be discussing the importance of protecting our seniors. We recognize the vulnerability that they have in these long-term care facilities. We recognize that it is something horrific that they are currently living with, the fear, the isolation, the uncertainty. And we will and we must be there for each other And our conversation tonight with the provinces will focus directly on how the federal level can support the provinces in their challenges, and how we can support the workers in these centres, and how we can better support our seniors.
Minister, you spoke a little earlier with regards to Quebec's request for military assistance. I'm just wondering, have you received a request from other premiers specifically relating to the military for help for long-term care facilities? And what sort of role do you see the military playing when it comes to long-term care facilities?
We have received 3 requests in total from Quebec, 2 for Canadian Rangers to help out in northern remote areas, both in Nunavik and in Bas-Saint-Laurent. This most recent request around help in long-term care facilities is somewhat different than the kinds of requests that the federal government usually gets around support for provinces, which is much more often around things like floods and forest fires. But we are, of course, working to help. We're working with Quebec to figure out how we can best help in this situation, because this is a situation that is unprecedented at many, many levels. And what we have continued to say is we will figure out how to help. We will be there for each other.
Good morning, Prime Minister. Salima Shivji, CBC News. It's April 16th today, and that was the day that your federal modeling said that there would be between 500 and 700 deaths in Canada and more than 31,000 infected confirmed cases. We're at nearly double the number of deaths. So I'd like to know what went wrong with the modeling and what does this mean for Canadians?
I think people need to understand that modeling is a framework that allows us to plan for different scenarios in the future. It is not a declaration of what is going to happen, but it is a discussion of what might happen in the coming days, in the coming weeks, and allows us to plan and prepare for it. I think one of the things we've seen over the past number of weeks is a far more severe impact on seniors' residences and long-term care centres than we had certainly hoped for, or more than we feared, and therefore we need to take more measures to protect our seniors. That's what I'll be talking with the premiers about tonight. Okay. Les modèles.
These models do not tell us what will happen, but prepare us for different possibilities of what could be. And I think that something we have seen over the last few weeks is that our seniors' residences have been more severely affected than we feared, and that's why we will be tackling this question tonight with the premiers.
Is the Canadian government prepared for some frontline workers, medical workers, to die in the fight against COVID-19? And what would the government possibly be looking at to support family members and dependents left behind?
There have been far too many deaths already in Canada, and that's why we need to continue to do everything we can to slow the spread of this disease and to protect our frontline workers with PPE that we're ordering in, with support for them, for their families as we get through this difficult time. And the most important thing is for Canadians to continue to stay home, to slow the spread of this virus, to ensure that those who go to work every day to keep the rest of us safe and to fight this virus are able to do so in safety for themselves and for their loved ones. We will continue to do everything we can to protect these heroes.
Bonjour, Monsieur Trudeau. Philippe Masson, de Radio-Canada.
Philippe Masson, Radio-Canada. I understand that you are bargaining or negotiating with Quebec, rather. We understand that, but how many people, how much medical personnel could you send? How many doctors, how many nurses, just to get an idea of what could be offered to Quebec in real terms? As I said, this is a request that's unprecedented. So we are developing different scenarios of how we can help. We will be there to help. We want to help. But exactly what it will look like, we are examining this. So you don't know if it will be 1 doctor, 50 doctors. We're discussing this with Quebec. I couldn't tell you. We're currently discussing how we will help you. We recognize that it is a very serious situation if Quebec's asking for the federal help like this, but we will be there. But precisely, we have to look into the solution together. And when would that be? Well, in the coming hours and days, we're working on this. If there's a request, it's because it's urgent. So we will do this as quickly as possible to be able to send the help.
Merci tout le monde.
Thank you, everyone.
And that concludes Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's daily address to the nation. A number of new measures introduced, particularly for small businesses. Let's bring in our chief political correspondent, David Akin from the nation's capital. David, a lot there. What stood out to you?
Yeah, well, let's just run through the highlights. There was a lot there. First, on the small business front, in response to some concerns that some small businesses we're not enough small businesses were getting the support they need. The emergency loan program has been expanded and enhanced, and the key metric there is how you can qualify. So if you're a small business that had a payroll in 2019 of anywhere between $20,000 and $1.5 million, you are now eligible for an emergency loan. And you get that loan, by the way, through your financial institution. So call up your bank and let them know that you're looking for a loan. They'll have some information for you. The second thing is the government announcing a new program. This is a new program called the Canada Emergency Rent Program, Relief Program. It's all about commercial rent. So this is businesses who've been saying, listen, I can't make the rent on my store or my factory, whatever it might be. The federal government is going to help to provide rent coverage for April, May, and June. Details of that program, TBD, as the Prime Minister is saying, rental relations are really a matter of provincial responsibility, and so that's what's going to happen once the Prime Minister speaks with the provinces. Speaking of which, that meeting, a teleconference, the First Ministers will have a discussion by phone this evening, and they're going to talk about that rental program, but also the other big public health emergency right now is the safety of seniors in long-term care facilities and in retirement homes. Quebec, we've just learned, has made a formal request to the federal government for some help, emergency help. That may be in the form of Canadian Forces personnel, it could be Canadian Red Cross workers, and it could be some volunteers that have registered at a Health Canada site. The Prime Minister is saying he couldn't provide any details about the help Quebec is going to get. It's going to get some help, he said, but they're still trying to figure out exactly how that help is going to come. For the rest of the country, who is also worried about long-term care facilities, that's really where the crisis is. One of the things the federal government is being asked for is some money to help top up the wages of workers in long-term care facilities. I'm certain you're going to hear that's what the premiers are going to talk about tonight as well. We also heard one last thing, Anthony, about that border with the United States. We do know, we were talking about this just before the special, that President Trump, is, quote, ready to talk about easing border restrictions between Canada and the U.S. The Prime Minister's point today is we're a long way, I think that was his phrase, a long way from significant easing of any restrictions on the Canada-U.S. border. So quite a bit in that press conference on business, on help for long-term care facilities, and on the border.
Yeah, and you mentioned the public health emergency with long-term care homes. He says that more needs to be done to protect the vulnerable seniors in this country. And, a lot more will come, of course, out of the call tonight. A lot of people say that this should have come a long time ago in terms of boosting the wages for these incredibly hard workers working at long-term care homes. I mean, you look across, in Quebec, for example, 150 long-term care homes in that province affected by the outbreak. 15,000 cases in that province. Obviously, that, among so many others, need the help. But when could that help come, not just for the employees, because that's one thing, but also real measures for these long-term care homes that desperately need the help?
Yeah, as we've heard, and this is one of those things where, really the provinces, of course, are the key actor here when it comes to long-term care facilities. All these facilities are licensed by provinces, the regulations are set by provinces, and so on. And the provinces know that, and they've been talking about that. And so far as we've been able to hear from Premiers Ford in Ontario, Legault in Quebec, the problem right now is not so much about rules and rule-making. We did hear the Prime Minister talk about some potential movement on that. The problem is a manpower problem, a nurse power problem. Doug Ford talking about we need more firefighters. That's the metaphor he uses to put out the wildfire in nursing homes. So this is a problem of manpower, and even if you up the wages of the existing workers, you're still going to be with a problem. You just don't have enough people who are trained. So right now the call is out for personal support workers, registered nurses, all sorts of nurses. Are you in retirement? There was some news this morning in Quebec that about 1,000 doctors who work in other areas are putting their hands up and saying, right, they're doctors and ready to go to work basically as nurses in long-term care facilities. So it's a manpower issue, and that's really at the heart of Quebec's request to the federal government, is just needing more bodies who can be either trained quickly or already have some skills to take care of people who can't take care of themselves right now.
It is a massive mobilization underway. Obviously, help is needed. David, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much. And let's stay in Ottawa and bring in our Ottawa Bureau Chief, Mercedes Stevenson. And we touched on that with David, Mercedes, the help that is being requested by Quebec, the third time, in fact. This time, and even the Prime Minister acknowledged this is a unique situation because they're asking for help for long-term care homes. Elaborate on what that would mean and what role the military could play, and really whether the military has enough resources to address the problem.
Yeah, and those are all great questions, Anthony, and I think we don't know the answers to a lot of them yet. And the Prime Minister alluded to the fact that they don't even know how this would work. They're looking at different scenarios. I talked to a very senior source in the military last night because we'd been hearing rumblings about this possibility, and they were saying at that time they had not seen a request, this particular person, but that they weren't really sure how this would work either. Now, the military has a lot of capabilities. Most of them relate to things like transport and logistics. So they might be able to help, for example, in the healthcare system, like they are up north right now with the Rangers, providing tents, helping people line up, helping register people. It's a whole other ballgame if you start bringing them in to care for people in long-term care homes. So what are the options for what that could look like? Well, that's a great question, and I have a feeling that military planners are getting creative right now to try to figure out how they support that. Does it mean that there's certain basic roles they could take care of that wouldn't be medical? So could they perhaps worry about things like delivering the meals or making the meals, disposing of the waste? Is this talking about bringing in medical care? Because you heard the Prime Minister say, that there's a limited number of people in the armed forces who are doctors. This is not like the U.S. military where there's a huge number of doctors and nurses who could be deployed. We do have them in the Canadian Armed Forces, but not in the kind of numbers where they could all go into these sort of long-term care homes and start providing service. But it's not necessarily doctors and nurses that are needed either there. It's that care and support. It's making sure that people get their bed sheets cleaned, making sure that they are receiving hygiene, that they're being fed, that their medications are delivered. And there are troops who perhaps could help with things like that. So they have to figure out how to do this. The good news is, Anthony, they have some people who are ready to go if they don't need medical experts. And that is 2 ship's crews who have just finished 2 weeks of being in complete isolation in hotels. They were being put out to sea to sit on ships to make sure they don't come into contact with anyone. So that is one option the military would have of people who they're sure would not bring COVID-19 into those homes. Whether or not they're going to use those Navy ships crews, we'll have to wait and see. They might use local reservists. They might use the military in Quebec. As you know, there's a very large base up CFB Valcartier in Quebec City. So this is an unprecedented request, and they're trying to figure out how they can make it work. The military will have to say what they can and can't do, and then the federal government can respond to Quebec's request from there.
Well, if there's any organization, and I use that term, in a general sense, that is more prepared for humanitarian missions like that, as we've seen them do across, in many countries around the world, it is the Canadian military, isn't it?
Well, they're certainly experts at adapting very quickly to situations. I mean, typically what they would be more used to doing would be something like a field hospital. And I know they have contingency plans for that if this pandemic overloaded hospitals, they would take over, for example, big conference centers and turn them into hospitals. But they can adapt. They will be trying to figure out how to best potentially do this. I know that in all of the provincial meetings, and we've talked about this before, there are Canadian Forces planners sitting there. So they have a pretty good sense of what the provinces might ask for, and they're sort of giving feedback on what could be involved. There's all kinds of plans called contingency plans that the military always has for essentially every possible scenario. And given what we've seen with long-term care homes, I cannot imagine that people in the military did not see that and start to think about what happens if we get an ask there. So it'll be very interesting to see what they come up with.
And we didn't hear too much about this next topic that I'm going to mention, the mental health issue in this country. And many health officials, have been calling, he mentioned this yesterday, a new portal, online help. But health officials across the country have been, demanding help and calling this the echo pandemic that is about to emerge. Is there any sense that where this is going to go? Because yes, there's a new initiative, but the problem seems to be getting bigger by the day, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it gets tougher and tougher. People are, very resilient and doing their best. But in particular, you have families that are in a very small space together, parents who are trying to work and look after their kids. You have people who can't see elderly parents who are ill. You can't see your friends. You can't see your colleagues. We're not used to that kind of social isolation as humans. And even though we have the technology to connect, it's not the same as seeing people in person. And that can be very, very hard, especially for people who have anxiety and depression. And we know that there's been a spike in the number of domestic violence calls. There's concerns about the impact on people's mental health that isn't seen and isn't resulting in a police call and therefore not measurable. So the federal government announced this portal, but the question is sort of, how many staff are they going to have operating it? How easily are you going to be able to access this? And we don't have answers on all of that just yet. There's certainly a demand and a need out there for people to be able to access mental health supports. And the longer this goes on, the longer people are isolated. You layer on top of that, it is a pandemic and people are worried about their health, and many are worried about their financial security and their jobs. So certainly a very tough time, and everyone's being told to hang in there. But it's also a time where people should make sure that there are ways to reach out for support and to do that if they feel that they need it.
Yeah, and the longer this goes on, the more difficult it becomes. Mercedes, thank you so much. Mercedes Stephenson joining us from Ottawa. And speaking of the mental health issue, just yesterday, Premier Kenney in Alberta announced $53 million for that province in terms of more resources to really help with this growing problem in that province. And let's go to Calgary. Heather Yerkes-West is joining us once again. Heather, let's touch on that a little bit too. And connected to all this, the mental health issue connected to the economic issue. And specifically the oil and gas industry have been asking for a bailout, asking for help. We didn't hear anything on that today.
Yeah, you talk about the mental health. We have to remember that people in this oil and gas industry are coming off of another very significant downturn. There are a lot of people that never got back to work, that never fully recovered from the last downturn. I've spoken to people that declared bankruptcy a number of years ago, were just maybe starting to make ends meet again, and then this has happened. So the toll that's having across people's mental health is really significant. We've been waiting to hear about a federal bailout for a number of weeks right now. I think daily we're harping on the fact that the finance minister mentioned it was 3 weeks ago that details about this federal bailout for the oil and gas sector were hours, if not days away. Well, we're 3 weeks now and counting. The sector is getting very anxious. The people that work in the sector are getting very anxious. A lot of small and medium-sized oil service companies say that they really, really need access to liquidity at this point to really keep themselves afloat. We had the promising news from OPEC earlier this week, but we're seeing the price of Western Canadian Select, which is the Alberta benchmark price for oil, dip below $5 a barrel again yesterday. So that really isn't bringing oil prices up. It's not expected to. Supply is still greatly outpacing demand, and we are running the risk of filling up all of the storage tanks across North America. And if that happens, that's where we could get into a situation where we are facing negative oil prices for Alberta oil, which could just be further damage to the Alberta economy, more damage to people's mental states right now. So, the anxiety is quite palpable here in Alberta.
All right, give us a sense of the negative oil prices. This is something we've been hearing a lot of, and the price obviously not good in many ways. What's the projection?
Yeah, it's hard to wrap your head around how we could get into negative oil prices, but this is because, we can, the oil sands can ramp down production, but they can't stop production completely. They need to keep some level of production going for safety reasons, just to kind of protect the infrastructure. And so because of that, we will still continue to see some production happening from Alberta. And if we're at a point where it's just not going anywhere, it needs to be dumped, well, we need to pay somebody to take that away. So that's the situation where we could be facing negative oil prices for what is a crown resource here in Alberta.
Now, Heather, we don't have a lot of time, but we're hearing in the neighboring provinces, British Columbia, especially in Saskatchewan as well, at least looking ahead to reopening the economy, easing the restrictions there. Are we hearing the same thing in Alberta?
We're not hearing about reopening anything specifically yet. That would come in the days and weeks ahead. But obviously, the Premier Kenney is very anxious to start looking at that. He says that as soon as it's safe, we will start looking at those measures. But right now, it is just too soon.
Yeah, that's the battle between the desire and the reality of the situation. Heather, thank you so much. Heather Yerkes-West joining us from Calgary. Now, if you're just joining us, a quick look at what we heard from Ottawa today. The Prime Minister says Canada is contributing to international efforts to develop a vaccine, saying Canada needs to help vulnerable nations coping with the virus. He also announced the creation of the Canada Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance Program. This program aimed at helping small business owners with rent for April, May, and June, something they've been asking for, certainly. The federal government is relaxing the requirements for the interest-free loans being offered to small businesses, also mentioning that 195,000 loans already have been approved. That works out to about $7.5 billion worth of credit. The Prime Minister will speak with the premiers tonight about better ways to help those in Canada's long-term care homes, saying the federal government received a formal request as well from Quebec to help in that province. Now, you can find full details on globalnews.ca, tonight on Global National. I'm Anthony Robart. Thank you so much for watching.
Okay. Bonjour et merci de vous être rejoint à nous aujourd'hui.
Hello, and thank you for joining us today.
Let me just start by reminding us all that our whole country together is running a marathon, and we are not at the finish line yet. Canadians have been doing a really good job at physical distancing, and that is saving lives. I know that it's very hard, but together we need to continue. We can't stop now. We cannot squander the gains that we have made so far. And all of us need only look at other countries where we see staggering casualties, horrific scenes at hospitals, to really understand how important it is for us as a country to stay disciplined. C'est un marathon et nous ne l'avons pas terminé.
This is a marathon and it's not over
Nous
yet.
faisons du bon travail quant à la distanciation
We are
physique.
doing good work
Ceux qui
with physical
savent des
distancing,
vies.
which is saving
Nous
lives.
devons continuer.
We must
Nous ne
continue to do
pouvons
so.
pas relâcher.
We cannot
Si nous laissons
relax
tomber,
our vigilance now.
nous n'avons qu'à regarder les régions du monde,
We have but to look
qu'elles
to
soient
other regions of the
loin ou
world,
proches,
whether
où
they are
les
near
pertes
or
sont
far,
énormes.
where losses are
So
staggering.
today, we are going to hear from Canada's Chief Public Health Officer, Dr. Theresa Tam, the Deputy Chief Public Health Officer, the Dr. Howard New, the Minister of Public Services and Procurement, Anita Anand, by video link, the Minister of Finance, Bill Morneau, also by video link, the Minister of Small Business, Export Promotion and International Trade, Mary Ng, et le Président du Conseil du Trésor,
And the
Jean-Yves
President
Duclos.
of the Treasury Board,
Dr. Tam,
Jean-Yves Duclos.
please.
Dr.
Hello everyone, bonjour à toutes et à tous. I'll begin with our usual update on the number of COVID-19 cases in Canada. There are now 29,826 cases, including 1,048 deaths. Close to 50% of the deaths are linked to long-term care homes, and 93% are in people over 60 years of age. For the lab testing, we've completed tests now for over 487,000 people, with 6% confirmed positive, as Canada continues to improve our testing to better track where the disease is spreading. As I said yesterday, there are signs our collective efforts, starting several weeks back, have had an effect to slow down the epidemic. Assuming our staycation for the nation over the long weekend has helped to maintain this trend, we now need to double down to stamp out outbreaks in high-risk settings. If the measure of a society is in how it cares for its most vulnerable, this pandemic has revealed the chink in our armor. Long-term care homes and seniors' residences have been severely impacted, but there are other vulnerable groups that urgently need our attention, including people who are experiencing homelessness and precarious housing. Not having a home, is a significant barrier to following public health advice, like maintaining physical distancing and hand hygiene. As well, it is important that resources and supports for infection prevention control are in place to protect staff, clients, and guests in shelters. Without immediate action, there will be more outbreaks and avoidable deaths with broader societal and public health implications. Some municipalities have taken action to secure additional accommodation to ease crowding and facilitate physical distancing. This is a good step forwards. Volunteers are reaching out to support homeless shelters, including making hygiene kits and helping to serve and deliver meals to those in need. We cannot crush this curve unless and until everyone is looked after. Let's come together and do this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tam. Et maintenant, je donne la parole au Dr. Howard New.
I will now give the floor to Dr. Howard Ng.
Merci et bonjour. Voici d'abord notre mise à jour quotidienne sur le nombre de cas
our daily
COVID-19 au
update
Canada.
on the number of
On
COVID-19
dénombre
cases in
aujourd'hui
Canada.
29
There are now 29,826 cases in the country,
48 décès.
including
Près de 50%
1,048
des décès
deaths.
sont survenus
Close to
dans des
50% of the
établissements de
deaths
soins de longue durée
are linked to
et
long-term care
93% des personnes
and
décédées étaient âgées
93%
de
of
plus de
deaths are
60
people
ans.
over 60 years of
Nous
age.
avons mené des tests en laboratoire sur plus de
For the lab testing, we've completed tests for over 467,000 people.
Le Canada
6%
continue
confirmed
d'améliorer les
positive.
tests pour mieux suivre
Canada
la
continues to improve
propagation
testing
de
to
la
better
maladie.
track where the disease is
Comme on
spreading.
l'a mentionné hier, certains signes
As
montrent
mentioned yesterday,
que nos actions collectives
there are
entamées il
signs
y a plusieurs
that our
semaines ont
collective
contribué
efforts,
à
starting
ralentir
several weeks
l'épidémie.
back, have had
Si
an
l'on tient
effect
pour
to
acquis
slow
que nos
down the
vacances à la
epidemic.
maison pendant la
Assuming
longue
our
fin de semaine ont
staycation
aidé à
for the
maintenir la
nation over the long
tendance,
weekend has
nous
helped to
devons
maintain the
maintenant
trend,
mettre les bouchées doubles
we now
pour
need to double
éradiquer les
down
éclosions
to stamp
dans
out
les milieux
outbreaks
à risque élevé.
in high-risk
Si une
settings.
société est jugée par sa façon
If the
prendre
measure
soin
of a
des
society
plus
is in how it
vulnérables,
cares for its
cette
most
pandémie
vulnerable,
a révélé le défaut
this
de notre
pandemic
cuirasse.
has revealed a chink
Les
in our
aînés dans
armor.
les établissements de soins de longue durée et
Long-term
les
care
résidences pour
homes
personnes âgées
and
ont été
seniors'
durement
residences
touchés.
have been
Mais il y a des groupes
severely
vulnérables
impacted.
dont il faut s'occuper de toute
But there are
urgence,
other
comme les
vulnerable
personnes
groups
sans
that
abri
urgently
ou
need our
situations
attention,
de
including
logement
people who are
précaires.
experiencing
Quand on
homelessness
n'a pas de domicile, il
and
est très
precarious
difficile de
housing.
suivre les
Not
conseils
having
de
a
santé
home is a
publique,
significant
comme
barrier
le
to following
maintien
public
d'une
health
distance
advice,
physique
public
et
health
l'hygiène
advice
des
like
mains.
maintaining
De
physical
plus,
distancing
il
and
faut
hand hygiene.
absolument que les ressources et le
It is
soutien
important
nécessaires
that
à la
resources
prévention
and
et au
supports
contrôle des
for
infections
infection
soient mis
prevention
en
and
place pour
control
protéger le
are in
personnel,
place to
les
protect
clients
staff,
et les invités
clients,
des refuges.
and guests in shelters.
Si l'on n'agit pas maintenant, le nombre
If we
d'éclosions
don't act
et de
immediately,
décès évitables
there will be
ayant des
more outbreaks
répercussions
and
plus
avoidable
importantes
deaths
sur
with
la
broader
société et
societal
la santé publique
and public health
ira en
implications.
augmentant. Certaines municipalités ont agi
Some
pour fournir
municipalities
fournir de l'hébergement
have taken
supplémentaire
action to secure
afin de
additional
réduire
accommodations
l'encombrement et de
to ease
faciliter
crowding
l'éloignement
and
physique.
facilitate
Voilà un
physical
bon pas
distancing.
en avant.
This is a good step
Des
forward.
bénévoles apportent leur soutien aux
Volunteers
refuges
are
pour
reaching out
sans-abri,
to support
notamment
homeless
en préparant
shelters,
des trousses d'hygiène
including by
et en
making
aidant à
hygiene
servir
kits
et à livrer
and
des
helping
repas
to
aux
serve
personnes
and
dont
deliver
le besoin.
meals to those in need.
Nous ne pourrons pas écraser cette
We
courbe
cannot
tant
crush
et
this
aussi
curve
longtemps que tout
unless
le monde ne
and
sera pas
until
pris en charge.
everyone is looked after.
En unissant nos forces, nous pourrons
Let's
y
come
arriver.
together and do
Merci.
this. Thank you.
Merci, Dr. Knu. And now we will hear from our Minister of Public Services and Procurement, Anita Anand. Anita, please.
Thank you, Christia. Before I begin, I would like to send a big thank you to Conquer COVID-19 and Haley Wickenheiser, who have been running PPE drives and distributing personal protective equipment. Stepping up for our communities and donating what you have on hand is extremely helpful. It is the Canadian way and complements our government's tireless efforts to purchase vital supplies for our healthcare workers. We are operating in a hyper-competitive global environment, which results in complex and sometimes unpredictable supply chains. But we are making progress, which I will discuss today. Je peux vous dire qu'il s'agit vraiment d'une démarche
I can tell you
d'approvisionnement
that this
d'Équipe
is
Canada
truly
à
a Team
laquelle
Canada
collaborent
approach to
tous les
procurement,
intervenants
with
et tous
all
les
hands on
autres
deck
de gouvernement.
and all levels of
D'ailleurs,
government working
je
together.
m'entretiendrai de nouveau
Furthermore,
avec mes homologues
I will
des
be speaking with
provinces
my
et des
counterparts in the
territoires
provinces and
demain.
territories again tomorrow.
In a market characterized by high demand, we are buying existing inventory where we can and placing large orders to create and maintain a steady stream of goods flowing from diverse sources over the coming months. Pour ce qui est de nos achats à l'étranger que nous
For
faisons
our
surtout
international
en Chine,
purchases,
nos
which are
fonctionnaires
largely
travaillent en
coming from
étroite
China,
collaboration
our officials are working
avec
closely
des
with
partenaires
partners
sur le terrain,
on the ground,
y compris des ambassades
which
et
includes
des
embassies and logistics
experts en
experts,
logistique
to get
pour
these
acheminer ces
supplies
fournitures au Canada.
into Canada.
In particular, we are working with Bolloré Logistics Canada, based out of Montreal, and with Deloitte Canada to provide help with transportation, receiving, storage services, and customs clearances. Cargojet and Air Canada have stepped up as well to bring home to Canada federal orders as well as provincial and territorial orders. And we continue to work with other officials in China, including our formidable ambassador, Dominic Barton, and diplomatic staff to navigate the current complex supply chain environment. Je tiens à remercier tous ceux et celles qui contribuent à
I want to thank
l'acheminement
all
de ces
those
produits
involved for getting
essentiels
those
au
vital
pays
supplies
et à leur
into the country
distribution à nos
and
médecins,
into the hands of our
à nos
doctors,
infirmières
our
et à nos
nurses,
professionnels
and
de
our
la santé
healthcare
en
professionals
fonction des
when
besoins
needed
et aussi rapidement que
and
possible.
as fast as humanly possible.
In addition to our international buying efforts, Canadian companies have responded en masse to our call out to suppliers at buyandsell.gc.ca. Through this call to action, we have signed contracts with suppliers like Geometric Energy Corporation, based in Calgary. This company will provide millions of nitrile gloves for Canada's healthcare workers. Au cours des dernières semaines, nous avons également entendu
Over the past
parler
few
des
weeks,
nombreuses entreprises
we have also
canadiennes
heard
qui
about the
augmentent
many
leur
Canadian
production
companies
et de
that are
certains
ramping up
fabricants
production,
qui ont changé
with some
complètement
manufacturers
leur chaîne
completely
de
shifting
production.
their production
I'm
lines.
thinking of Canadian companies like Bauer in Quebec that have gone from making hockey gear to making face shields for frontline medical workers, or Stanfield's in Nova Scotia that is set to provide us with 100,000 medical gowns per week, to name a few. Je suis très heureuse d'annoncer que nous
I'm
pouvons
very happy
ajouter
to
un
announce
autre nom
that we can
à cette
add
liste
another name
de
to
plus en plus
that
longue.
growing list.
Le gouvernement du Canada a signé un contrat avec Irving
The government
Oil
of Canada has
qui
signed a contract with Irving Oil,
une partie de sa chaîne
which has
de
retooled
production
parts
pour
of its
produire
production line
un
to produce
désinfectant
much-needed
pour
hand
les mains dont
sanitizer.
on a grandement besoin. Leurs produits commenceront à
Production
être livrés
will
au
start
cours
being
des
delivered
prochaines semaines.
over the next few
The
weeks.
government of Canada has signed a contract with Irving Oil, which has retooled parts of its production line to produce much-needed hand sanitizer, and Irving will start delivering in the next few weeks. This is part of more than 20 million liters of hand sanitizer that we've ordered, including an order from Fluid Energy in Calgary. These companies and many others serve as great examples of the Canadian ingenuity and tenacity that will see us through this crisis. Je souhaite maintenant vous parler des dernières commandes
Let me
et
now turn
livraisons
to the
des
latest
produits
orders
très en demande
and
sur
deliveries
le marché.
we have of the most in-demand supplies on the
We
market.
have chartered 6 flights, and they have arrived in Canada, and we expect approximately 4 more in the next week, carrying a variety of goods from China, including N95 masks. These flights are, of course, in addition to goods that arrive by other means. As of today, we have ordered just under 300 million surgical masks and approximately 145 million N95 respirators. To date, we have received deliveries of more than 17 million surgical masks, and as the Prime Minister said earlier this week, roughly 800,000 N95 masks were delivered to the provinces and territories last week, and we expect 1.1 million to reach them this week. Nous avons aussi commandé plus de 900 millions de paires du gant et déjà 14 millions sont arrivés au
and more than
Canada.
14 million
We have
have arrived in
finalized
Canada.
orders of up to 30,000 ventilators with CAE, Starfish, and ventilators for Canadians. All three are Canadian companies that will be manufacturing these life-saving machines right here at home. These are only some of the supplies that we have on the way and a handful of the Canadian companies that are rising to the challenge. We are operating in a hyper-competitive market, and while demand for these supplies is going up, Canada and Canadians are keeping up. Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anita. And now we will hear from our Finance Minister, Bill Morneau. Bill, please.
Well, thanks, Christia. Good afternoon to everyone. As we come together to stop the spread of COVID-19, the government's working hard to support the economy. We're also trying to listen to the needs of Canadians so that we make sure that we get it right. We know that many small businesses are worried about paying the rent, about paying their suppliers, and paying their employees, people who've worked side by side with them for years. Last week, we launched the Canada Emergency Business Account, which is offering interest-free loans of up to $40,000 to small businesses and to not-for-profits. And 25% of that loan is forgivable if it's paid back by the end of 2022. I want to give you an update. To date, more than 195,000 loans have been approved through Canadian financial institutions. But we've also heard that there are many small businesses who need support, but who didn't qualify for these loans. So today, we're announcing that we're expanding the eligibility requirements to allow businesses that have between $20,000 and $1.5 million in annual payroll to apply. So I'd encourage those organizations to reach out to their financial institutions by phone or by email to find out how to actually apply. Aujourd'hui, nous annonçons que nous élargissons les conditions d'admissibilité au compte d'urgence pour les entreprises canadiennes afin d'y permettre l'accès aux entreprises dont la masse salariale annuelle se situe entre $20,000 et $1,5 million. Communiquez avec vos institutions financières par
Communicate
téléphone
with your
ou par
financial
courriel
institutions
pour
by
savoir
phone
comment
or by
faire
email
l'application.
to find out how you can apply.
Money will be there to help businesses to bridge through to what we expect will be better times. We know that in every corner of our country, small businesses are the heart of our communities. They represent the best of our country, that you can work hard and bring a good idea to fruition and provide for yourself and for your community. We also know that many organizations are worrying about their rent, the rent that's coming due. We know that we're all in this together, and I want to start by commending the landlords who are offering relief to tenants that are facing hardship. We need our businesses to remain strong so that when this is over, they can continue to be good tenants and pillars of our community. In recognition of the challenges that are facing Canadian businesses and commercial property owners, we're announcing our intention to introduce the Canadian Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance Program for small businesses. The program will seek to provide loans, including forgivable loans, to commercial property owners who provide small businesses with rent reductions for April, May, and June. To do this, we're going to need to work in partnership with provincial and territorial governments who govern the commercial property owner-tenant relationships. We'll continue to work with provinces and territories on this proposal to ensure that we can enhance support for hard-hit small businesses, and we will have more to say on this in the very near future. ont reconnaissance des défis auxquels sont confrontés les entreprises et les propriétaires d'immeubles commerciaux au Canada, nous annonçons notre intention d'introduire l'aide d'urgence du Canada pour les loyers commerciaux des petites entreprises. Le programme aura pour but de fournir des prêts et des prêts remboursables aux propriétaires qui offrent aux petites entreprises des réductions de loyer en avril, mai et juin. Pour ce faire, nous devrons travailler en partenariat avec les provinces et les territoires qui régissent les relations propriétaires-locataires. Nous continuerons de travailler avec les provinces et les territoires sur cette proposition pour accroître le soutien aux entreprises durement touchées et nous espérons avoir plus à dire à ce sujet bientôt. To businesses across Canada, we want you to know that we will continue to listen to you. We'll have your back. We know that this is an extremely difficult time, and we're not going to stop working to find ways to support you and to support your employees. Thanks very much. Thanks, Christia.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much, Bill. And now, also by video link, we will hear from our Minister of Small Business, Export Promotion and International Trade, Mary Ng. Mary, please.
Thank you so much, Christia, and Bill, thank you. Bonjour tout le monde. I'm glad to be joining all of you by video conference today. There's no question that small businesses and their employees are some of the hardest hit in this crisis. And from the very beginning, we said we were going to listen and we were going to adapt to what you tell us. This is why what we've done and what our government has done will continue until we get to the other side of this. A few weeks ago, as the finance minister said, we launched the Canada Emergency Business Account to help our small businesses who are struggling to keep up with their operating costs and their cash flow. And under that program, small business owners can go to their local bank or credit union to apply for an interest-free $40,000 loan backed by the government. À ce jour, environ
to date, about 195,000 loans have been approved.
That's 195,000 small and medium-sized business owners who are getting the help that they need to keep up with your operating costs, your utility payments, topping up your employee salaries and wages to complement the 75% wage subsidy. Today's announcement to expand the eligibility criteria for this program will mean even more businesses will qualify. It means that your favorite restaurant can keep the lights on while they switch over to delivery service. It means that small furniture store that usually relies on foot traffic to stay afloat can continue to pay the costs of upkeeping their warehouse space. It means that that physiotherapy clinic can top up the wages of their rehired 5 employees to 100% along with the support of the wage subsidy. It means that the local bed and breakfast can maintain their property while they've had to temporarily close their doors. We've also heard that businesses, we've heard them loud and clear, that they're going to need help paying the rent, and that's one of the significant operational costs and that they have to keep up with, and that's what we intend to do. You've heard from both the Finance Minister and the Prime Minister that we will introduce a Canada Emergency Rent Assistance for small businesses, and this program will provide loans and forgivable loans to commercial property owners who will in turn lower the rent for their small business tenants for the months of April, May, and June. And of course, we will work closely with the provinces and territories on this, given that this falls under their jurisdiction, and we'll have more details to share soon. Il s'agit de sauver des emplois.
This is about saving jobs and keeping businesses going.
This is about saving jobs and keeping businesses going. And I want to assure all small business owners and entrepreneurs out there that we are in your corner. We're listening, and I won't rest, and I know my colleagues feel the same way, until we've done everything possible to support you. Merci beaucoup. Thank you. I'm now going to pass it to my colleague. Thank you very much, Christia.
Okay, thank you very much, Mary. Et maintenant, je donne la parole au président du Conseil du Trésor.
To the President of the Treasury Board, Jean-Yves Duclos.
Merci, Christia, et bonjour tout le
Thank
monde.
you, Christian,
J'aimerais dire un mot rapide au sujet de la situation des aînés au Québec, particulièrement ceux qui vivent dans des centres de soins de longue durée. Nous sommes tous interpellés et même bouleversés par la situation dans laquelle beaucoup de ces aînés se retrouvent présentement. La situation très difficile aussi dans laquelle beaucoup des préposés et des travailleurs des CHSLD se retrouvent aussi. Et c'est le cas du gouvernement fédéral aussi. Le premier ministre Trudeau l'a à nouveau indiqué ce matin. Le gouvernement canadien souhaite exercer sa capacité d'appui aux provinces dans des circonstances extraordinairement difficiles. Alors, pour rappeler un peu ce qui se fait déjà et ce que nous aimerions continuer à faire, donc les efforts de la Croix-Rouge canadienne que nous appuyons, je pense, sont importants. Les efforts aussi de Santé Canada pour ajouter à la liste de bénévoles que le Québec est en train de développer, ajouter à cette liste de bénévoles une liste que Santé Canada a déjà commencé à accumuler au cours des dernières semaines. Là, on comprend et on entend très bien la demande qui a été formulée au ministre Bill Blair pour un appui des forces armées canadiennes, un appui autour duquel les discussions et des décisions éventuelles ont présentement cours et seront éventuellement communiquées. Et en terminant, mais aussi souligner à quel point appuyer nos travailleurs, les travailleurs de première ligne dans ces milieux tellement importants et difficiles à la fois. Donc cet appui est absolument essentiel et le premier ministre Trudeau hier a rappelé que le gouvernement canadien souhaite accompagner les provinces, dont le Québec, qui veulent augmenter les conditions salariales de ces préposés et autres travailleurs de première ligne partout dans les secteurs essentiels de notre société, mais certainement dans les milieux où se retrouvent nos aînés. Donc on sait qu'on veut le faire à long terme, à quel point ces services essentiels demandent que l'on appuie correctement les travailleurs essentiels, mais aussi on veut le faire à court terme. Et j'aimerais donc rappeler non seulement ce souhait, mais ce travail collaboratif important que nous avons à communiquer à l'ensemble des Canadiens, mais aux Québécois en particulier.
To improve the assistance to Canadians, but Quebecers in particular. Thank you. We are now ready for your questions.
Deputy Prime Minister. So we'll start with 3 questions on the phone and turn to the room. 1 question, 1 follow-up. Opératrice.
Thank you. Merci. La première question est de Raymond Filion, TVA.
The first question is from Raymond Filion, TVA.
Oui, bonjour. Par rapport à la capacité d'appui du gouvernement fédéral, justement, pouvez-vous nous dire quels sont les effectifs que le fédéral possède pour répondre à la demande du gouvernement du Québec? Combien de militaires, combien de bénévoles sont disponibles pour répondre à ce qui est demandé du côté de Québec?
To meet Quebec's requests.
Ça fait partie évidemment des discussions importantes qui ont
This is part of the
présentement lieu entre
significant
les deux
discussions
gouvernements.
that are happening
Ça dépend
between
évidemment
both governments.
des circonstances dans
It
lesquelles
depends on the
les effectifs des forces armées
circumstances in
canadiennes
which
pourraient être amenés,
Canadian
appelés à
forces
travailler
could
aux
be
soins,
called upon to work
en particulier au sein
in care,
des CHSLD. Donc, tout
especially in
dépend
long-term care
évidemment
facilities.
des conditions que
Everything
le gouvernement du
depends on the
Québec aimerait
conditions that the government
offrir
of Quebec
en
would like
matière
to
de
offer
lieux et de
when it
responsabilité de
comes to
travail aux membres des
responsibilities and
forces armées
working
canadiennes.
conditions to
On
members
sait
of
que
the
les
Canadian
forces
Armed
armées
Forces.
ont des compétences
We know that the armed
multiples,
forces
ont
have
des capacités
multiple
d'appui
skills.
multiples. Et donc, ce qu'il faut faire, comme on le disait il n'y a pas longtemps,
As we were
c'est que
saying,
ces compétences
it's important
s'inscrivent
to
dans un
match
esprit de
those
leadership
skills
provincial, donc d'appui
and to
à ce qui
ensure that
existe
we
déjà sur le
respect
terrain.
the leadership of the provinces.
Mais combien de ressources vous sont demandées par le gouvernement du
Many
Québec? Est-ce que vous
resources
avez
are
des
being
chiffres à nous
requested by
donner?
the government of Quebec. Do you have any
Bien,
numbers?
ce sont des chiffres, mais pas seulement que des chiffres,
There
mais
are
aussi des
numbers.
conditions de travail pour lesquelles les discussions
But
sont
we also
absolument
have working
importantes
conditions.
maintenant. Le gouvernement
We are
canadien
discussing
a
those
reçu une
conditions
lettre
right
hier
now.
soir
The government
du
received a
gouvernement
letter
du
last
Québec
night
pour
from the
accélérer
government of
ces
Quebec
discussions.
to accelerate
Donc, à la
those
fois le
discussions,
nombre de travailleurs,
which
mais encore
includes
plus
the number
important,
of workers,
le
but
type
more
de
importantly,
travail
the
que ces
type
travailleurs
of
vont
workers
être appelés à
that
faire
will be
font
called
partie
upon.
des discussions actuelles avec le gouvernement du Québec.
This is part of the discussions that are ongoing with the government of Quebec.
Prochaine question.
Thank you. Next question.
Thank you. Merci. The next question is from Laura Osman, the Canadian Press. Please go ahead. La parole est à vous.
Thank you. Minister Anand, I have a question about
the supplies for N95s. We're hearing from some doctors who are joining nurses' unions and calling for the use of N95 masks whenever in contact with potential COVID-19 patients to enhance their protection for those on the front line. And they're worried they might not have the supplies to accommodate that. The government is obviously trying to stock up as much as possible, but will frontline workers have enough if demand for N95s increases beyond what we're seeing now?
Thank you for the question. I will say that we have received over, just in the past 2 weeks alone, around 2 million N95 masks that are expected to be delivered to the provinces in total by the end of the week. So that's the first point to directly answer your question on numbers. But I want to give you a picture of the global environment and not sugarcoat it. We are operating in an era of high global demand, and we must watch the supply chain from start to finish until these masks and other PPE find their way directly back to Canada and are in a warehouse for distribution. And so monitoring that supply chain from start to finish on the ground in China, for example, is a key priority of our ministry and our government, and we will not stop until we have the supplies that Canadians need. We have a very solid team on the ground in China. We have been working very closely with Ambassador Barton, but we've also retained private companies, Deloitte Canada and Bolloré Canada, for example. And those companies are assisting in our efforts to ensure that we have a steady supply of masks and other PPE coming into Canada. Again, it's complex, but we are managing it under these very tight global conditions.
Follow up?
Thank you. And perhaps for Minister Freeland, I'm wondering if your intelligence officers provided you with a Canadian-produced assessment of the coronavirus threat at that incident response group meeting in late January. And if so, what were their conclusions at the time?
Laura, I am not at liberty to go into any details of intelligence shared with me and the government and other ministers. But what I can say is that Canadian intelligence analysts and officials are following and have been following from the outset the coronavirus pandemic. This is currently the biggest threat that Canada faces, and it is absolutely appropriate for our intelligence officials and analysts to be following it closely. And that intelligence is shared with the government, with key ministers, and it absolutely has and continues to inform our response.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. Next question on the phone.
Thank you. The next question, la prochaine question, Hélène Buzetti, Le Devoir. Please go ahead. La parole est à vous.
Yes, hello. My question is actually for Dr. Tam. Last week you said that according to Canada's prediction, there would be between 500 and 700 deaths by today. We now have about twice as much. So my question is twofold. A, how do you explain the discrepancy? And B, what does it tell us about the curve we're following? Last week you presented us with 4 scenarios with 4 rates of infection, 1%, 2.5%, 5%, 10%. And we were under the impression that we were following either the 1 or the 2.5% curve. So given today's numbers, which curve do we now seem to be following?
So those were sort of planning scenarios, first of all. But let's just talk about where the epidemic is at. And we do know, and as I said yesterday, the actual doubling time for the cases, confirmed cases in Canada has been slowing down. That's actually, that's the trend. So that you are seeing that curve bending. The issue in terms of modeling or projecting deaths, that's not even modeling, is that has to change over time. And it reflects, I think, several different phenomena. One is the epidemiology of the outbreak itself. So when the high proportion of cases occurring in long-term care facilities, for example, unfortunately results in higher fatality amongst the people who get the illness. So I think that is the current picture right now. At the beginning of any epidemic, the case fatality will be underestimated. And this is a phenomenon of both the time it takes for someone to undergo the full clinical course of their illness to the final outcome. That's sort of the numerator. The accelerator at a slower rate at the beginning. And then, unfortunately, after a number of weeks, those who have been infected, who are vulnerable and at high risk will unfortunately die from the illness. So this is the phenomenon I think that we're seeing. At the same time as if the actual, so that's a numerator, sorry. At the same time as if the denominator is slowing down, when the growth rate is slowing down, at the same time as the number of deaths are going up, that ratio is going to increase. And I think that's what we're seeing right now. And we might expect that ratio to continue to increase as the epidemic slows down, but also then the population now being affected and the higher proportion of death that we expect to see in the older age groups and those with underlying medical conditions. So these projections, I think you were thinking of the short-term forecast, are very sensitive to our actions, but also to the epidemiology, and that projection has to change really very quickly on a daily basis.
So as a follow-up then, last week we said that the expectation was maybe to have 4,400 deaths. So does that prediction change now given this situation, how the situation has evolved over the last week?
Yes, so the projections are sort of looking at a number of days out. And if you actually look at that projection, the number of cases projected very, very closely to what was predicted for April the 16th. So I think at that time we've projected the number of cases being just over 22,000 to 31,000 cases, and we're now currently tracking in that sort of time, that frame for the numbers of cases. So then is the number of deaths. And as the case fatality, that ratio increases. Again, any number that I sort of present right now will be subjected to change as the ratio changes. So our modelers at the last look are projecting anywhere between 1,200 to 1,620, so 1,620 deaths by April the 21st. So again, any number that I provide you will be subjected to variations as we change those projections over time.
Merci, docteur. On va prendre les questions dans la salle.
Thank you, Doctor. We'll now move to questions in the room.
Hi there, Marika Walsh with the Globe and Mail. I'm wondering, either for Dr. Tam or for Deputy Prime Minister Freeland, if you can explain why the number of warehouses stocking supplies from the National Emergency Strategic Stockpile were reduced, and whether that led to a reduction in the amount of PPE that was also stockpiled by the federal government.
So I think the consolidation of warehouses are a reflection, I think, over time that changes in terms of the distribution of equipment. And that there are, I actually looked at that we now have 6 locations for our NES warehouses. And they were, so supplies, for example, the Regina warehouse, as we noted, was closed. But it reflects how goods or supplies can be transported in different ways now and more rapid ways compared to decades ago. You now have the environment for shipping and sending supplies is quite different. So that had to change with the times and with the consolidation of the effectiveness of the distribution system itself. And so I think, in terms of PPE, I think over time, I think renewal of the stockpile occurred, as we said, where we were not used to providing expired PPE to others. As we move sort of forwards, given this experience, we have to optimize product life cycle, but also minimize perhaps the disposal of expired stock. Now, they do take up quite a lot of space, but you have to sort of manage that. And, obviously there's sort of a backup, if you like, then perhaps to the non-expired stock, but that's not necessarily a practice that had been done in the past.
Right, that didn't answer my question of whether or not the same level of PPE supplies were maintained despite the closures, but I have another question for either, again, Deputy Prime Minister Freeland or for Dr. Tam. The Canadian government a number of weeks ago gave a nearly $1 million COVID-19 research grant to a researcher at the University of Alberta to work in collaboration with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The research is to help to develop a form of rapid testing for the virus. The Wuhan Institute of Virology, of course, is from the center of the original Outbreak. Can you explain why Canada is funding a collaboration with this institute and what expertise or specialized knowledge the institute can bring to bear on this research?
I don't know if Dr. New knows the answer to this question. We will talk to our colleagues at the Canadian Institute of Health Research or the funding organization and determine that. Obviously, though, in general, understanding the biology of the virus or some characteristics of it is, I'm sure, very useful in determining the type of diagnostics and other work that's needed. And I think, obviously all hands on deck to try and resolve the issues needed in terms of the science and what kind of testing capability might be needed. So I can't comment on the specific project, but we'll get back to you on that.
Can you answer though to my direct question whether PPE supplies were maintained despite the closure?
I think we'll get back to you on that. What we've had, as I said, the National Emergency Strategic Stockpile was not really set up to back up the whole of the country's healthcare system. That is the responsibility of provinces and territories and their stockpile. We were more focused on very highly pathogenic and unusual organisms, such as the Ebola virus with its special kind of personal protective equipment that might be required for that sort of setting, or very, very unusual pathogens that provinces and territories are not able to or don't really have as much of a role in for preparing for those very unusual pathogens.
Van Dusen, CBC. So we know what is going on in seniors' homes is reprehensible, and seniors need help now. So the question would be, I guess, to either Mr. Duclos or to Chrystia Freeland, what specifically is François Legault hoping that soldiers will do? We know that he needs doctors, he said that, but he also said, j'ai besoin de bras, j'ai besoin de tout le monde. He said he needs everything. So would they be serving meals, doing maintenance? If you could be specific, because a lot of people want to know.
We received, as the Prime Minister said, we received late last night a formal request from the province of Quebec for direct aid from the Government of Canada and from the Canadian Armed Forces. We are looking urgently at that and are looking urgently to see what the Government of Canada, what the Canadian Armed Forces, what the Canadian Red Cross can do to help. We agree that this is an absolutely urgent situation. In terms of the precise tasks that Government of Canada personnel could do and the precise numbers, that is something which is being discussed even as we speak. There will be a First Minister's call later today with the Prime Minister and all of the premiers. I will join the Prime Minister on that call and support him. And, you know, I want to emphasize, as Jean-Yves has already said, we are fully seized of the urgency here. We are working very hard to support the province of Quebec, as is the federal government's job. We don't have details to offer at this moment on personnel or tasks because those need to be worked out, but they are being worked out right now.
Okay. I think this question would be also for your Deputy Prime Minister about the possibility of labor shortages in the food supply chain, unless that would be for someone else. But we know that some meat plants have had COVID-19 outbreaks, and just wondering is there any contingency plan to deal with labor shortages should it get worse?
That's an excellent question, Julie, and that is something that our government has been working on, that I've been personally focused on over the past few days. We have been talking with industry leaders. Food processors are an essential part of our food supply chain, and food security is clearly really important in a crisis like this. We are lucky in Canada because we are a major food exporter. I am so grateful to all of our farmers and ranchers and food processors. But you're right that the coronavirus poses particular challenges to food processing facilities because of the dangers of contagion there. And we're working closely with the industry to find ways to be sure we can keep the food supply chain strong and working. And I'll add just one thing, which I heard from a leader in the food processing sector this week, which is Canadian food processors are experts in decontamination. You might say that that is an area of particular necessary focus for that sector. They know how to handle this, and the government appreciates that expertise, and we're working with them to be sure that they can continue to work and that we can continue to have food in our grocery stores and on our tables. And just finally, I really want to thank all the people, all the Canadians who work in the food processing sector. These are really hard jobs. They are really essential jobs. Thank you very much.
We're hearing about a situation at an oil sands camp in northern Alberta. Now, what concerns do you have about COVID spreading at these work camps?
That is another good question. And the work camps are, of course, an area of particular vulnerability. I have had a number of conversations with Premier Kenney from the very outset about very thoughtful measures that both the province and industry are taking to minimize the possible spread of coronavirus in the work camps. And, you know, that is an effort that we need to continue. And where the coronavirus does appear, we need to be very, very swift in containing it. And I will say that the province of Alberta, the provincial public health response has been very strong to date, and I have every confidence it will continue to be.
Okay, thank you. And workers sometimes come from other provinces. So when they leave the work camps, should they be self-quarantining at home? Is there anything in place to make sure they're safe or we're safe until there's a period of time where we're all clear on that?
As you know, Mike, some provinces and territories do have in place self-isolation requirements for anyone coming into the province from outside. The provinces and territories that have put those in place have done it for a very good reason, and they expect, and I expect, all Canadians to follow those very important rules.
For Minister Freeland, Rachel Haynes here from CTV National News. President Donald Trump has talked about easing restrictions on the border with Canada. The Prime Minister said that we are still weeks away. It's too soon to talk about easing any kind of restrictions, but obviously that's being brought up with our neighbor. If the U.S. does reopen its border with Canada, would Canada then be in a position where we would have to follow suit?
So thank you for the question. And I'm happy to share with you and with Canadians that we are even as we speak, just over the past couple of days, we have been engaged in productive conversations with our American neighbors about the border restrictions. Canada believes that the right thing to do would be to extend those border restrictions. We just discussed the restrictions that exist within our own country on travel between provinces. The neighborly thing to do right now is for all of us to be staying at home and to travel only when it is absolutely essential. So the way we can be good neighbors to our American friends is by maintaining those restrictions. And we are currently having very constructive and productive conversations with our American neighbors about precisely that.
Obviously, Donald Trump, though, does have a reputation of not being so neighborly when it comes to Canada, as we've seen it over the past few years. So if they do decide not to be neighborly and open the border, can you guarantee now that Canada will not open our border to Americans until it is absolutely safe to do so?
I can guarantee one thing, and I can offer some information. What I can guarantee is decisions about Canada's border are taken by Canadians. Full stop. And when it comes to easing border restrictions of all kinds, our government will only do that when it is appropriate and when it is not a risk to the health and safety of Canadians. When it comes to our discussions and our relationship with the United States, during the coronavirus pandemic, and specifically with regard to the border, the relationship has been extremely friendly, extremely neighborly, and extremely effective. We put in place restrictions on non-essential travel at the border in a reciprocal and coordinated way, and those restrictions are working. We have a huge decrease in travel across the border. At the same time, essential travel and essential trade in food, in medical supplies continues. So the relationship, in fact, is working really, really well. And we are going to keep on working hard to ensure that that continues to be the case.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. We'll now turn back to the phone for 3 additional questions. Operator.
Thank you. Merci. The next question, la prochaine question est de Micheline Laflamme, Radio-Canada. La parole est à vous.
Et bonjour. Concernant la demande d'aide du Québec, le Premier ministre a mentionné qu'en plus de l'armée et de la Croix-Rouge, vous allez tenir compte des bénévoles spécialisés qui sont inscrits sur le portail de Santé Canada. Alors, est-ce que vous pouvez nous dire combien de Québécois se trouvent sur cette liste?
Quebecers are on this list?
Comment vous allez
And could you
coordonner
indicate
l'offre
how you
pour
plan to
répondre aux besoins
coordinate
du
the
Québec?
offer
Je
to
ne sais pas
meet
si vous pouvez
Quebec's
déjà nous
needs?
donner des exemples
I'm
qui
not
ont
sure
été
if you can
faits
give
jusqu'à
us
maintenant.
examples of what's already been done.
Une excellente question. Alors, c'est à plusieurs
Excellent
niveaux
question.
que le travail se fait. Il y
Work
a
is being
autour de
done at
30
many
000
levels. There's
bénévoles
about
qui ont
30,000
déposé leur
volunteers
offre de
that have
travail et de
proposed
collaboration au cours des
their
dernières
services
semaines
over the
dans le
last
site
several
de Santé
weeks
Canada.
on Health
Ces
Canada's
bénévoles sont
website.
répartis à travers le pays,
These
ont
volunteers
différentes
are throughout
compétences,
the country. They have
différentes
different
habiletés
skills
linguistiques
and
aussi.
different language
Et
skills.
le travail collaboratif se fait bien entre Santé Canada
Work between
et
Health
les
Canada
agences de santé des
and
différentes
public health
provinces, dont
agencies
le
from various
Québec,
provinces,
pour
including Quebec,
partager
is going
ces
well.
informations pour faire en sorte
Information
que
is being
par la
shared
suite,
in
le
order to
gouvernement du
ensure
Québec en
that the government
particulier
of
puisse
Quebec
utiliser ces
can
informations
use
pour
this information
solliciter les
in order to
expertises et la
solicit the
disponibilité de
expertise
ces bénévoles.
of volunteers who are
les
available.
bénévoles n'ont pas toujours besoin d'être
Volunteers
physiquement
don't always
présents
need to
à
be
un endroit
physically
en
present
particulier
in a
parce qu'une partie
specific
du travail,
location.
par exemple, se
Part of
fait
the work
pour faire le suivi
could be
des
to
cas de
conduct
contagion qui se
follow-up
sont
of
déclarés,
cases
ce qu'on
of
appelle le suivi
confirmed
des
contagion,
contacts
which
des
is
gens
contact tracing
contagieux
with people
avec des
who
gens
are
qu'ils ont pu
contagious,
rencontrer au cours des derniers
to follow up
jours,
on
des
people
dernières
that they may
semaines.
have
Donc, par exemple,
encountered
c'est un travail qui
in the
peut se
last
faire
few days
à
and weeks.
distance.
That's
On
work
doit
that can be
évidemment
done
tenir compte des
remotely.
compétences, comme on
We will,
disait,
of
de
course,
ces
take
gens-là,
into
mais
account
aussi
those people's
des
skills
habiletés linguistiques
as well
dans
as
le
their
cas du
language
Québec. Donc,
skills
les
in the
échanges
case
vont
of
bien.
Quebec.
On a évidemment
this is going well. There's a great deal of consideration for the fact that it's support for the considerable work that Quebec is doing to mobilize other workers through other methods in Quebec. I think that this collaborative effort is very useful, but also much appreciated.
Micheline, en suivi?
Micheline, your follow-up?
Richard Garceau du Centre hospitalier universitaire du Nord Moncton a constaté qu'un arrivage la semaine dernière de
indicated that last week that the kits made in China to conduct testing were contaminated. We're talking about 320,000 swabs. Were measures taken to ensure that this doesn't happen again? Is there other medical equipment coming from China that could not be used because it did not meet Health Canada's criteria?
Thank you so much for the question. The issue of quality control of goods coming from outside of Canada, and in this case China, is one that we are watching very closely. On the ground in China, we make sure to have quality control checks there. And then on the ground in Canada, the Public Health Agency of Canada also runs inspections. And where those goods are unusable, we then move to a secondary or tertiary supply chain to ensure that we can fill the gaps that are caused by those contaminations. And so it is a constant place of attention for our government to make sure that the goods that are getting out to all parts of Canada are in acceptable use quality condition, and it is something that we take very seriously from point A to point Z. Having said that, in this particular case, it appears that there was a mishap, and it is something that we are taking very, very close watch over to make sure it doesn't happen in the future. And in terms of the inspections done in Canada, those are done by the Public Health Agency of Canada, and so it would be appropriate for Dr. Tam to add any words here.
Yes, so when it comes to the swabs, this is a supply that's already in place. It's someone that is a supply that's already approved by Health Canada, and so swabs can go directly and be distributed to the province and territories. When there's an issue that arises, we support the testing again of those swabs. And then moving on to looking at innovative ways to look at whether you can actually sterilize them. So that is the work that we were doing at the National Microbiology Lab, as well as, of course, then looking for replacement swabs through many different channels, including some of the domestic innovative channels as well. So again, we managed this together with the province and territories very rapidly in the last days.
Oui, et je voudrais ajouter seulement que
I would just like to
les
add
écouvillons,
that when it comes to the swabs,
quand on a découvert qu'on a eu
when
un
we
problème
discovered that there was
les
a problem
importations de la Chine,
with
on a
imports from
travaillé
China,
très, très
we
vite
worked
pendant la fin de
very
semaine
quickly
de Pâques,
over the
surtout
weekend,
moi
over
et
the
la
Easter weekend
ministre
especially,
Anand,
myself
et
and
on a
Minister Anand,
trouvé des autres
and we found other
des
sources of
qui
swabs
sont maintenant
that are
au
now
Canada.
in
Ils sont
Canada.
déjà arrivés.
They have already
Et je
arrived.
voudrais assurer les
I wish
Canadiens
to reassure
que
Canadians
nous avons assez d'écouvillons
we have
pour
enough
ce moment.
swabs
C'est très
right now.
important parce que les
That's very
écouvillons sont
important
essentiels
because
pour
swabs
faire
are
les tests.
essential to conduct tests.
Merci, Madame la Vice-Première ministre. Prochaine
Thank
question,
you,
s'il vous plaît.
Deputy Prime Minister. Next
Thank you.
question,
The
please.
next question, la prochaine question est de Ryan Timothy. Please go ahead. Your line is now open.
Yeah, this question's for Dr. Tam. You talked obviously before about the metrics that you were tracking and the data that you were seeing. In terms of being able to start to return to normalcy, is there a specific metric that you think will be really key to the country being able to return to more normal life?
I think there's going to be quite a number of them that we'll be watching for. As I said, we have to be very careful not to call the peak early. We'll not see the estimation of whether we've passed the peak until we've actually passed it. So that we have to look for very carefully. And then the sort of trend towards the downward side of that epidemic curve, we'll be monitoring that trajectory for sure. And from a public health perspective, is do not let up on the public health measures on the way down. When you're at the bottom of that curve, that is the number of cases has been reduced, transmission dynamics. So when we talked about the reproduction number, looking at that too, making sure that the transmission is not occurring. And I think last week we talked about the concept of that reproduction number. And what we're looking for is an effective reproduction number. Of course, that is way below 1, and you don't want that to be above 1 where transmission can occur. So I think those dynamics are very important. Of course, you have to ensure that all measures are in place to prevent any further infections in those vulnerable settings. So if for long-term care, for homeless settings, for acute care, you want to make sure that it's not just a matter of numbers, and epidemiology is about making sure infection prevention control measures are in place and the health system continues to be ready for any potential surge that might actually happen in the sort of new phase. So those are some of the metrics or triggers that we're discussing right now with the provinces and territories.
Any follow-up?
And so when you say that there would have to be infection control measures in place to prevent, I guess, like a second outbreak or smaller outbreaks, what sort of things would have to be in place, and what are you doing to put them in place?
So I think some of the capacity pieces we've outlined, and I think provinces and territories have done a great job in trying to elevate that health system capacity to prepare for surge. And so I think continuing to double up on that, making sure, for example, we've been talking about ordering ventilators, personal protective equipment, having all the infection prevention and control guidance in place so that the health system itself is ready for that surge. And also in long-term care settings, I think there's a ways to go in ensuring every one of these places and seniors' homes have the necessary measures. Of course, at the federal levels, we provide a number of guidance, but also I think you've heard the government provide a number of support so that workers, so that these different settings have the type of resource support they need to actually implement some of those recommendations as well. So also I think workplaces is important to be able to adjust to the concept of physical distancing in all of those places that currently have really been, working in innovative ways. I would say we really encourage, even in our own work context, the teleworking arrangements, but also really thinking ahead at, well, how does physical distancing actually work in our workplace? What kind of physical arrangements, workflow, lines on the floor, all those different systems might be then our new normal of how we reduce infections. And so I think all of those measures have to be in place. Of course, we'll be watching very carefully as people discuss border measures, is that to be mindful of the minimizing the importation risk. Of course, that's very important. But most importantly, I think at this juncture, is that Canadians are fully engaged and know what it takes to actually reduce transmission risk. And everybody's been learning about all of those things, whether it's hygienic measures, washing your hands, covering your cough, and being able to adjust to those physical distancing measures. So there's a number of areas I think that needs to be very rapidly planned for, so that we can look towards what that new normal might look like.
Thank you, Dr. Tam. Operator, one last question on the phone, please.
Thank you. Merci. The next question, la prochaine question est de Mélanie Marquis. La presse, la parole est à vous.
Merci. Bonjour, ma question est pour Mme Freeland concernant les négociations qui ont cours avec les États-Unis sur la frontière. J'aimerais savoir si vous avez discuté de la question des demandeurs d'asile irréguliers, parce que son père, il y a 2 semaines environ, vous disiez que vous vouliez obtenir des garanties quand on a appris que certains de ces migrants-là étaient renvoyés dans leur pays d'origine. Alors, j'aimerais savoir comment ça progresse ce dossier-là.
I'm wondering how that file is progressing.
Merci pour la question.
Answer. Thank you for the question.
Et je veux souligner que nous prenons très au sérieux nos engagements internationaux concernant le traitement des réfugiés. Et le Canada va suivre tous nos engagements.
Will keep all of its commitments.
Le Canada les
Today, Canada is upholding its commitments. We have redirected individuals back towards the United States because the United States also have to respect international obligations, especially when it comes to individuals who are redirected by Canada.
Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire précisément? C'est qu'ils sont pas, ils renvoient plus les migrants dans leur pays d'origine?
Question: Are they not sending migrants back to their country of origin?
Je peux vous assurer tous les Canadiens parce
I
que
can
je sais
reassure
que c'est un
you,
enjeu
as well as all
important pour les
Canadians, because I know that this is an important issue for Canadians.
Aujourd'hui,
Canada today
prend très au sérieux les engagements
takes
internationaux
international commitments very seriously.
Le redirigement,
when it comes to redirection,
dans la manière
we
que
are
nous
doing it
de suivre nos engagements internationaux.
Indicated while respecting our international agreements. Thank you. This is the end of the press conference for today. Thank you.